Hi everyone and welcome to One Autistic Person. This video is an update on the video that I did around the NHS about a week ago. I just wanted to give you an update on what happened because I think that this is indicative of a major problem that there is within the NHS at the moment. One, the fact that we're being asked to compromise care and the care isn't there for us as autistic people, and that we are seen as a problem. And the second one being that the people who don't see us as a problem seem to be absolutely cut off at the knees to be able to actually help us with anything. So this is the day after the last time I created the last video that I created, and it's taken me this long to sort of put this one together because it was really not pleasant. But it was really interesting and really telling. And there was some part of the conversation I had with my GP, which I really wanted to sort of have a conversation. I wanted to say to people what I said, because I think it was a really important conversation that I had, which pointed out where the problems were, but also how we should or how I feel we should be communicating with our GPs, because I think the GPs generally want to help. I might be wrong there. I might be just talking about my GP there, but in my experience, that when you actually get to speak to a GP, which we'll get to being able to speak to one in a second, that it can be that they can be helpful. At the end of the day, a GP is there as the gatekeeper to be able to help you to get through. You have to first get through the receptionist gatekeeper, which is 10 times harder. But once you've got through that, they are there to advocate for you as well as sort of refer you. But they are also there to advocate for you. And I do feel like mine is going to try and advocate for me, even if it's not going to come to fruition. And that's great that is the case. It helps the cause because it helps the fact that if a GP is trying to help, then that means that we are in a good position to be able to have somebody on our side. I don't think they're able to do very much, but at least if we speak to them, they might actually try. So, first things first was the receptionist. So I was told, as I said in the previous video that I did, I was told that I needed to ring the next day to be able to speak to a doctor. I panicked then, thinking, oh my God, what happens if I can't speak to a doctor? I really need to speak to a doctor because there was discussions I needed to talk about moving forward. My medication needed to change. And I also needed a doctor's note for work as well, because I'm currently off sick. And I needed to have a conversation with the doctor. They can only give you 2 consecutive sick notes before they have to, or at least that's the way that our surgery works, that it has to be that you have 2 consecutive sick notes and then you have to have a review. But the sick note ran out that day because I didn't know that was the case. So for me, that was a massive panic on the fact of it ran out that day. I know that I could have given it later. I kind of already knew that was a possibility, that I could have just given it and it would have been backdated to my employer, but I just didn't like the idea of going a whole week of not knowing after having this big diagnosis, plus the fact of having to deal with the fact of my work not having a piece of documentation, which I didn't know where they would go, what work would feel like in relation to that. So I spent all night worrying about it, all morning worrying about it until it got to 8 o'clock when I could ring. And then I rang at 8 o'clock. First person that I spoke to, as the person told me, because her computer was taking ages, she seemed fine at the beginning. But then as soon as I said I've been diagnosed with CPTSD, she asked me what CPTSD is, which is fine. She doesn't need to know what CPTSD is. I explained and she went, oh, mental health. I went, yes, mental health. And she went, well, we haven't got an appointment until next Thursday. And I said, I don't need a face-to-face appointment. I just need to have a telephone conversation with a doctor. She said, it is not a medical emergency. You do not need to speak to the doctor on the phone. I said, I think I do. I said, and I really would like to speak to a doctor on the phone. She went, for a mental health problem? I mean, yes, for a mental health problem. She said, well, how is it an emergency? And I said, well, CPTSD is a very, very complex illness, and being in a situation that is this stressful and having to wait till next Thursday could cause me to have some really serious repercussions to my mental health. And she went, is that a threat? I said, no, it's not a threat. I haven't threatened anything. I've just said it could have a really detrimental impact on my mental health. Please don't threaten me, was the next thing she said to me. I said, I'm not threatening you. I'm just telling you that this could have a really detrimental effect on my mental health. And if I could speak to a doctor today, even if it's just about the doctor's note that runs out today that I was told that I needed to ring for, I'll speak to him about that, and then I can make an arrangement to speak to him about the other stuff afterwards. She said, well, I'll see if he will ring you. But I don't know. And I just had to say, okay, thank you. He did. But anyway, that said, she just obviously had some issues around mental health. I have made a complaint about her. But I then got a call from my doctor about half an hour later, something like that. It wasn't long afterwards. He was great, sorted all my medication out for me. I'm staggering off one medication and staggering onto another, so there's kind of like it's very complex. So he spent a lot of time doing that before the phone call. So I was really, really grateful. Really lovely guy. But then it came to the conversation around my psychological care, as in my the work that I will need to do with the mental health team, and the person who's diagnosed me has given very specific instructions around the psychologist that I have. So it needs to be somebody who is a clinical psychologist, which apparently is a bit of a problem in itself. That is experienced enough, as well as somebody who has an understanding of trauma and also the effects that trauma can have on autism, or what effects autism can have on have on CPTSD. But specifically trauma. She didn't actually say anything about CPTSD. She said trauma. And the thing with it was that the doctor then said to me, that's quite a complicated thing for a person to have. And it's like, it really isn't. It really isn't a complicated thing for a doctor to have. A doctor needs to have a psychologist, even at the basic level of just doing your degree, to complete your degree, you will have done a lot of work on trauma. So the understanding of trauma is a baseline. It is an absolute baseline of being a psychologist to understand trauma. Okay, the autism side of things, a little bit more complicated, but it really isn't that complicated. But it actually only takes a bit of a Google search, which I'll go into in a second anyway. But he said, you have dealt with mental health services before, so you do know that you're going to have to jump through hoops for this. And it's like, why should I have to jump through hoops to get the healthcare that I am due? I have a healthcare need, I have a mental health care need, and I shouldn't have to jump through hoops. And he said, well, even if you don't need to jump through hoops, you're probably going to have to compromise on the therapist. And I was like, do you know what? Usually I would just say yes. Usually I'd just say, okay, I'll compromise on that. But compromising on my therapist is absolutely pointless. I will ultimately compromise any potential outcome if I compromise the therapist. So any outcome from that therapy will in itself be compromised, and therefore I'll be either no better off, which is wasting the resources from the NHS that they're constantly saying they have issues with, or I'll be worse off, which is really bad for me, and I don't want that at all. And I'll be a further drain on resources for the NHS, because if I'm worse than I currently am, then I'm probably going to end up in A&E, or I'm going to end up in inpatient care. That's creating a load of issues. There's no positive for me, and there's no positive for the NHS in the situation. I don't understand why it's saying compromise on. Why should you have to compromise it? It doesn't mean that that you're not going to get the benefit out of it. Otherwise, it's just me going through the motions of going through therapy, rather than going through therapy for an outcome that's beneficial to me and to the NHS. It doesn't make any sense whatsoever to say you will need to compromise on your therapist. Absolutely not. Those two things are necessary. Understanding of trauma and understanding of ASD. And I'm going to go through in a second about what the needs are from the ASD situation. And actually, it would only take some very minor changes plus a conversation with me to be able to adapt the care as NICE guidelines make clear should be the case with somebody with autism and CPTSD. For me, the main issue with the NHS is it's not at all about resources. It is about the fact that they are stuck in a way of the way they've always worked. And when it comes to psychology, what they do is they throw CBT. I said this in the last video, CBT or DBT. DBT is relatively new in comparison, but they just throw that at you rather than looking at the fact that you're going to have to adapt for each person. That's basically all it is. They're not going to adapt. They don't want to adapt psychotherapy. They just want to say, right, this is the box, put them in that box, get rid of them. And it's like, that's not going to happen with me. I'm not going to be able to do that. It's going to take longer, and it's going to take some adaptation to the way that the service currently is, because it's not a cookie cutter situation. I am not just somebody who you can go, oh, do a bit of CBT and forget about all of your problems. That's not going to happen for two reasons. One, I'm autistic, and two, I've got CPTSD. Neither of those things are going to allow me to forget them. The trauma that's caused CPTSD was long lasting. It was multiple traumatic situations that were extremely distressing, as well as the fact that being autistic in itself can be quite traumatic, and we can suffer from PTSD even if we've only had it's only been a matter of reaction to being autistic, is that we've had small traumas across our lives consistently. I've had that, as well as significant trauma at multiple different times in my life that have created this situation. The thing with the way my doctor was, he clearly wanted to help, and he did end the conversation with, I will do everything I possibly can, but you know the fact that there are issues within mental health services, but I will do everything I possibly can, which made me feel like it's great. I love the fact that he wanted to do that, and it was really nice that he said it, and he was really nice to me. And he agreed with me. He said, he was like, I hadn't really thought about that. When I said the word compromise, he said, I didn't think about the fact that, yeah, of course you are. You compromise on your therapist, you're compromising on your care, and therefore you're not going to get the outcome that you want and the outcome that realistically the NHS should want. The problem is that shows is that, yes, he wanted to help, but he hadn't got a clue how to word it to me in a way that wasn't going to be going to make me feel really like I was insignificant and didn't matter. And actually, that it made out that anybody going for mental health care really isn't bothered about the outcome. They're just bothered about the fact that they can tick some boxes and say they've gone through therapy. I've seen many things recently where that have been concerning for me with when it comes to mental health and therapy. One of them being I watched I'm a Celebrity, Get Me Out of Here, and there was a person in there that was saying he'd been through therapy, but he was still clearly very much distressed by. And he said he'd gone through it, and he actually finished his therapy. That's the point I'm trying to make. And he said, I felt like I'd got everything under control, but what it was very clear was that he'd pushed everything to one side. And it's like, that isn't what therapy is about. Therapy isn't about pushing everything to one side, and especially when it's really complex. And it is very complex for me for various reasons, and I want to face it. I want to face everything that I've been pushing to one side. I don't want to continue to push it to one side. So therapy is not going to be about, let's find a way to forget about those things and pretend they haven't happened. For me, it's going to be about exploring them and finding ways to get through it and to work with it. But that is going to mean longer periods of time, and et cetera, that I'll go into in a second when I come to how I am happy to compromise and what actually that care would look like. But yeah, it felt very much like the NHS system, when it comes to mental health, they haven't got the first clue what they're doing. And unless you pay for therapy, I really worry that nobody's going to get any help that's actually going to be of any benefit to them, is going to mean they can actually deal with any issues that they've got. That's how it feels from my perspective anyway. It feels very much about, let's just ignore the problems and let's make you take SSRIs that are going to make you feel better, but not deal with the root cause. That is really how it feels. And I don't believe it's a resource issue. I really don't believe it's a resource issue. I believe that may be part of the problem, but a lot of it is that there's a lack of care. And there's a lack of understanding of what is actually needed from a mental health service. I think it's one of the things that we are really, really far behind when it comes to understanding healthcare is mental health services. That we're saying there's a mental health crisis in this country, and there is. But the reason why that mental health crisis is at the extent that it is that we've basically been telling people for the last 30 years, 40 years that we've been having serious mental health care within the NHS, I think we've been telling people to ignore things, and I think people are no longer able to ignore those things, and I think that's why it's as bad as it is, because these are now exasperated mental health issues because of the fact that they weren't dealt with, or a root cause wasn't found previously, and we were told to ignore them. So for me, I am happy to make some compromises. I am not happy to make compromises on the understanding of what my psychologist has in relation to trauma. They would have to have an understanding of trauma, otherwise I wouldn't want them as a psychologist anyway, because of the fact that they're not a psychologist. You're not a psychologist if you have no knowledge of trauma. It's right there from any study you do, from counselling to all the way up to being going through to a PhD. Trauma is a through line that goes through all of your training whenever you're doing anything in relation to psychology. So that I'm pushing to one side. So the things that I can find that would be beneficial, and I absolutely agree with this, is so longer sessions but further apart, or shorter sessions but 2 a week, for instance. So but for me, I feel like the longer sessions but further apart would make more sense. So having a 2-hour session, it's not 2 hours, but booking 2 hours in. So usually you have 50 minutes of that hour as your actual session, and 10 minutes is for the psychologist to write notes up and do anything they need to do. So if you book 2 hours in and they had 20 minutes to do that at a maximum, I will go into a bit in a minute where I don't think that the 2 hours would necessarily be exactly what was needed, but how it could be beneficial to the NHS to book 2 hours. So if you booked in 2 hours for me, and I would never probably need 2 hours. I might need in total an hour and 20 minutes, an hour and a half, but that would then give half an hour to the therapist for them to do their notes or anything else that they need to do. What I would see it as is that second potential 50 minutes that's added onto it. So in total, 100 minutes is your maximum you can have for a session. That it just would be, you get to the 50 minute an hour mark and sort of say, right, we need to look at where we're going with this at this point. Not exactly like that, obviously. You do it as a softer landing, not hurry up. But I probably would be looking at an hour and 10 to an hour and 15 minutes that I would probably need in a session, but I would need longer between each one of those sessions. So I wouldn't need it every week. I'd need it every 2 weeks, which means I'm getting no more hours of sessions than anybody else is. I'm just getting them further apart than somebody else is, because for me, that processing time between each session would need to be longer for me to be able to really get through. It'd take me the first week for me to be able to really process what I discussed in that session. The second week would allow me to put things together in my head so that I would be able to speak about it further in my next session and look at what I would want to do moving forward. So that, like I say, that would then say that you would have 2 hours. The psychologist would have 2 hours. That'd give them 45 minutes to be able to catch up on work. And one of the things that I know psychologists say they have a lot of issues with, and I'm sure they do, is they don't have enough time to type notes up. They don't have enough time to do further learning, that type of thing. Maybe that 45 minutes could be spent learning about autism. That could be really beneficial to their career. But I'm not having any less than what I need, and they're getting more time than what they need. So beneficial to both. Longer time off sessions, so longer run of sessions. So basically, from what I can understand, and this again makes sense, is that you don't limit, when somebody's autistic, you don't limit the amount of sessions they can have. You shouldn't be doing this with people who have CPTSD anyway. It should be that it is until you are ready to leave therapy. It could be 2 months, it could be 6 months, it could be 2 years, it could be 5 years that it takes to deal with that situation. And the same goes with autism, is that if you're having therapy and you're autistic, that not putting it as a 6 week. I mean, how anybody can be ready to go back into the world after they've gone through all of the process to go through a mental health service situation, and they only need 6 sessions. I don't know. I don't see how anybody can. But that's coming from an autistic person's perspective. Maybe a neurotypical person would be okay with having 6 sessions and would feel they could move on. I personally do not feel like 6 sessions would have even come close to coming to the surface of anything that's happened in my life. So the thing would be that we just say that these sessions are there's no time scale on them. They will be until we're ready to, as the psychologist, to sign you off, and you as the patient, that you feel comfortable being able to move forward. Obviously, there might be some pushing at the end if you are ready and you're not ready to accept you're ready. There might be some guiding you ready to go into that thought process. but it just isn't a matter of 6 sessions. It's looking at the likelihood is going to be months, if not years, worth of therapy. I don't want them to have a full understanding of autism, but it doesn't take long to learn the basics. It really doesn't take long to learn the basics about autism. Autism is extremely complicated, but it really doesn't take a lot to understand the traits of autism. It really doesn't understand the facts, to understand just the basic things. And if you just Google search it on Google search autism and PTSD or trauma and therapy, all of those things, it will tell you about these things that I've already said. And the only other thing that's really added into it is that you will need to, the biggest thing is longer actual sessions, more time between sessions, no limitation on the amount of sessions, and the last one is that the last one is, if you can, try and relate that therapy to a special interest, somehow allowing that person to link how they go through therapy to a special interest, because then that will allow them to be interested in it for them. And that makes absolute sense if you can link it to a special interest. So, for instance, I'm not saying this is what it would be, but let's say you could link it to The Sims. I would then be able to, I don't know, use The Sims as a way of being able to process my thoughts in it and make Sims do things or build something in The Sims that would be relative to how I feel about the situation. That, for instance, so maybe build a building in The Sims that is in relation to all of my traumas, or whatever that is. Because I don't know what the therapy is going to be, but it might be that that's what it is, and that I create a sim for each one of them, and that I do something with them to make it so that those traumas are something I can process. I'm not a therapist, so I don't know. I have done counselling training, and that's kind of where I would be thinking of doing things if I was further ahead and was a psychologist, because obviously a counsellor doesn't sort of imply these kind of things, but psychologists do sort of imply that you try things out to try and process things with their guidance. So I'm only going on what my kind of knowledge of trauma. I don't have the knowledge I do have about autism and what I've looked at myself. So that would be specifically a way that I may be able to do it. I don't know whether that would be beneficial. I don't even know whether it'd be harming for me to do that. But that comes to mind as one of the things that maybe can happen. One of the things that I read was somebody relating their trauma to dinosaurs, and they also enjoyed writing, so they got them to write a book and create a book about dinosaurs, but that was related to their trauma. That was somebody who was a child, and it apparently really helped them. So and it makes sense. It makes sense. I would be able to relate that to my trauma, and then be able to talk about it with the person that's doing that's my psychologist. It just doesn't take a lot. There's like 4 things. You do exactly the same as you do it with anybody else with PTSD, apart from those four adjustments, which are made by NICE, the people who give guidelines to the NHS of how to care for people. But it clearly is too much of a problem. And like I've said, I would expect a psychologist to have a very good knowledge of trauma. It's a basic expectation of a psychologist. If you don't understand trauma, then what are you doing being a psychologist? So as you can see, it's extremely frustrating that I'm being asked to compromise when I don't think it would take that much for a psychologist just to quickly learn about autism enough to be able to know what they would need to do. So what I've done just to end this off is kind of looked at how much, if each one of us, when it comes to a CPTSD situation, because I know that they talk about resources all the time, so I want to make a point around resources. So the average salary of an experienced psychologist in the UK is around £55,000. So the average hours worked for a psychologist is 40 hours a week, which equates to £26 per hour. This would mean if this was an additional to the current situation, to the current service from the mental health services, so if it needed to be additional hours, it would cost £1,352 per person per year. Just let that sink in. £1,352 per year it would cost for this for each person to have this therapy. Because that, like I say, is an experienced psychologist, and that's in the middle of the salary that can be for an experienced psychologist. So it could be anything from, I think it was about 52,500 up to 57,900, something like that. So I was just going on the average of it being around 55,000. So £1,352 a year, if they did need to add this as an additional, I don't feel they need to add additional psychologists into it, but let's say they needed to take one psychologist on that was able to do this per, so we've got 40 hours, let's say that the actual amount of time that they spend in doing things is 30, so per 15 people. Bearing in mind, I don't think most people who are autistic would have a major issue with having an online therapy session. So you could basically do this across the country if you needed to, or you could just have one per service. It just baffles my mind why this would be such a major issue. It feels like they don't want to understand how autism and trauma relate, which is ironic, seeing as we're told we're an epidemic by the NHS pretty much. That the number of us is growing so exponentially that we're putting so much such a crippling issue onto the NHS. Or maybe if you stop putting us into if you stop putting us into in-house care, so going into inpatient, not in-house, inpatient care, because of the fact you're not dealing with the trauma in the community. And if you look at how much it would cost in relation, so it's like £534 million is spent on inpatient care for autistic people. Yes, that includes people who definitely need to be in inpatient care, but the estimation is that it's about £180 million saving if they just dealt with the trauma within the autistic community, rather than having to getting to the point where we're that traumatized by the trauma not being dealt with, and also traumatized by the NHS, because it is a very traumatic situation to deal with the NHS, especially if you are autistic, and especially if you're autistic and you have a trauma-related condition. They add to the trauma. They traumatize us. So it's like, just understand that you could save £100 and something million a year. £100 and something million a year could be saved just by spending £1,352,000 per person. It makes no sense whatsoever. Trauma and autism come very much hand in hand, and the fact that that we're being called an epidemic and that we're growing exponentially, and that diagnosis is going through the roof. Do you think that because we're having a lot of people who are late diagnosed, that also that number of people, that 34 to 42% of people who are autistic also suffer with PTSD at some point in their life? Do you think that's going to increase the more people that get diagnosed at a later age? I can guarantee that is going to be the case. If you've gone through your whole life masking and not realizing you have, and you've got to your mid-30s, your brain has probably struggled to get through that, and therefore is much more likely to have some mental health condition attached to it that could be quite considerable. It just stands to reason. So why not try and put those things in place now, while it isn't as epidemic as you think it's going to be, so that the resources are there. Don't do that, and you're just going to end up with a hell of a lot more problems than what you have now. It's not going to get any better whenever you just stick your head in the sand and pretend it's not happening. So another ranty one from me, so thank you very much for listening to it. I hope this makes some sense. I am going to put in the thing that I put in the last one with the NHS changes document. It is a PDF, unfortunately, that you'd need to print out and write on or type on or put additional to with a Word document and send off to them. I don't know why they haven't got an online thing. I said this in the previous video. Why it isn't online, I don't know. Maybe it's to stop people from actually interacting with it, because going through all this process is actually quite frustrating. But if you have issues with the NHS and you feel like you could tell the government how to change it and how you think that those changes should look, then please do spend the time doing it, because I think it's really important moving forward that we are listened to, that we are advocated for, and that we are able to advocate for ourselves, and that GPs are not feeling that they are completely stunted and can't do anything because of the fact that our mental health services is so diabolically bad. and it goes on all levels. I would actually say that CAMHS is much, much worse than adult mental health services. Adult mental health services is really bad. CAMHS is terrible. They really do not want to accept the fact that any child has mental health issues. And if we just caught it early, if we caught mental health conditions much earlier, if we diagnosed autism earlier, anything that is diagnosed at an early stage is good. Anything that you've had for years and it's not being managed, it's not being able, don't have an understanding of it, it is going to be more detrimental to us. And I wish the NHS would look for prevention rather than cure. But when it comes to mental health, it's not even a cure, it's an ignore. Just ignore it. There's no cure to it. There's no even looking to cure it. It is just just ignore it, pretend it isn't happening, push it away, don't think about it. And that's not going to end up with a healthy civilization within a country, regardless of their neurodivergency, regardless of where they are on the neurodiversity scale, neurotypical, neurodivergent, and everything that comes under those overarching headings are not going to benefit by ignoring the fact that everybody has mental health, and sometimes that mental health is detrimental to our success within life. It just doesn't make any sense whatsoever. I have never come across a more uncaring group of people when it comes to mental health, which is ironic because it just feels like it's pull yourself up by the bootstraps, get on with it. That's the way that mental health works, is that you tell people to just get on with things. And it's like, that isn't how it is. You need to help people first, and then they'll find their way to pull themselves up by the bootstraps. I can tell you now, I would much rather not have CPTSD and be able to get on with my life without the really, really negative effects that CPTSD has on my life. I really wish I didn't have it, because it is extremely, extremely difficult to live with. Whereas autism isn't. A lot of the time, for me, autism isn't that difficult to live with. I can adapt my world to autism. I can't adapt my world to CPTSD. There's no adapting to it. I need to get through it. I need to work through it, and I can't do that myself. I need somebody to talk to that isn't somebody who knows me, and it's somebody who needs to understand that is going to be damaging to me before it makes me better. I need a professional to talk to about it in depth and to understand it myself and to work through it. But it doesn't look like I will get that from the NHS. I am going to try. I really want to try, but it really does look like that's not what I'm going to be getting. So it looks like it's going to be yet another thing that I'm going to have to pay for, as most autistic people do when it comes to mental health care. There was something on the Autism Society website, the Autism Society. I can't remember this National Autism Society. My brain's a bit fried. Which I'll put in the comments here as well, which said that a huge number of people had to basically resort to paying for it themselves because the NHS just weren't going to supply it to them, and were basically told, jump through hoops and you'll have to compromise, I suppose, or it doesn't exist in the first place. So yet more cost on top of having a disability already. Great, fantastic. So thank you very much. Like I say, another ranty video. Thank you very much for watching, and I hope to see you on the next one. As always, comment, let me know how you experience the NHS. Any subscribing would be fantastic. The more subscribers I have, the more people that see these videos, which would be fantastic. Thank you very much, and I hope to see you on the next one. Thanks. Bye.